All right, so in the last video, we saw that the life of theoretical wisdom is the best life for a human to lead. It is the life that best leads to happiness or human flourishing, and it does that because it is the full realization of our function or purpose. Right? It makes us emulate the first mover as perfectly as we can if we grasp the objective truths about the universe. Okay, but there is also, according to Aristotle, a second best life, and it deals with another type of wisdom. So instead of theoretical wisdom, the second best life deals with practical wisdom. So why is this still a valuable life? Well, because it's still an exercise of our rationality, so it's still an exercise of our function or purpose. It's still a way of us realizing our unique potential as human beings. But it's not as good as the theoretical life because it's aimed at sort of temporary truth or truth about humans or truth about the experience of humans and their desires, right? It's not aimed at the ultimate truths of the universe. It's aimed at truth with the qualification that it's about correct human action. There are all multiple ways of getting at the idea. So here are two things that Aristotle says about practical wisdom. So since virtue in character is a state involving decision, and decision is appetite involving deliberation, both the reason must be true and the appetite right if the decision is to be good. This thought, in truth, is practical. By contrast, when thought is theoretical and not concerned with action of production, its good or bad state consists simply in it being true or false. For truth is the function of theoretical thought, but truth agreeing with correct desire is the function of practical thought. Okay, so what's going on in this first quote? Well, the rough idea is he's just giving you a clear way to distinguish between the two types of wisdom, right? So we know what theoretical wisdom is. That's not dealing with any actions or productions of goods in the world. It's really just aimed at what is true and what is false. But practical wisdom, which he describes in the first half here, is about deliberating and discovering what is true or what is appropriate with regard to human action, and then how to make our appetites and actions match up with what is in fact good. Okay, we'll get into that in a second, a little bit deeper. But okay, and then the second quote. That which is proper to each thing is by nature the best and the most pleasant for it, and for man this is the life according to mind, since the mind most of all is man. This is the happiest, so that's the theoretical life. The life according to the other kind of virtue is happiest secondarily, because the actualities in accordance with this virtue are human. So that's another way of getting at the distinction. Right? We can live this life according to mind, and that would be the best, because it's truth. You're trying to discover the truth in an unqualified way. But the life of virtue is secondarily happiest, because it's dealing with truth only as it deals with humans, right? Truth qualified by the idea that it's true for humans instead of just true simpliciter. Okay, so let's get a little deep into this. So practical wisdom will still lead us to a valuable life because it's still an exercise of our reason. Remember, in both of these quotes, he's talking about how much it takes our deliberating powers to figure out what is appropriate, what is best to do in these situations, or to make our decisions good. So if it's dealing with our deliberation, it's still an exercise of our reason or rationality. However, this life is going to be the second best because it's only aimed at truth agreeing with correct desire instead of unqualified truth. In other words, practical wisdom is about understanding the truth about what is appropriate in ethical matters and then attempting to make one's psychology match up with this by desiring the right things. All right, so hopefully you're seeing that big distinction between just truth overall, universal truth, truth simpliciter, versus just the truth about what's appropriate in ethical matters, or the truth about what's appropriate for humans. So for Aristotle, we can know what's appropriate in ethical matters. We can have this practical wisdom when we come to have knowledge of what is virtuous. Okay, and here we get Aristotle's doctrine of the mean, where he says, virtue of character is concerned with passions and actions. These admit of excess, deficiency, and the intermediate. For instance, both fear and confidence, and appetite and anger, and pity and in general pleasure or pain may be felt too much and too little, and in both cases not well. To feel them at the right time, about the right things, towards the right people, for the right aim, and the right way, is the intermediate and best condition, and this is proper to virtue. Now, virtue is concerned with passions and actions, in which excess and deficiency are in error and incur blame, while the intermediate condition is correct and wins praise, which are both proper features of virtue. Virtue, then, is a kind of mean, since it aims at what is intermediate. Okay, so when we have practical wisdom, we somehow have knowledge of the virtues. And as Aristotle was just saying, a virtue can be found somewhere in between two sets of extremes. Right, so I think the easiest example for understanding this comes from courage. And so imagine what the two extremes are when thinking about the courageous person. You could say if a person fears everything and always runs away, well, then they're a cowardly person. Right? They lack all courage. If a person runs headfirst into every situation, right? So say it's 1 versus 1,000 and you still charge headfirst into the situation, we're going to call you reckless. Right? That's not courageous. It's just sort of stupidity, right? It's an overabundance of courage. So the courageous person is the one who lands somewhere in between the cowardly and the reckless person. Right? In other words, and here's the key part, right? They have a bit of knowledge. Right? They have wisdom. They have knowledge to know what is appropriate in this ethical situation. So they have practical wisdom. Right? They know when it's appropriate to overcome their fear and move forward, but they also know when fear and retreat is appropriate. Right? So the courageous person has knowledge about when it is in fact appropriate to act. Okay. So then to wrap this up, practical wisdom comes with understanding the virtues. Right? Since knowledge of the virtues just is knowledge of what is appropriate in ethical matters. Right? So what do you do? How do you live the best life here? Well, you get some knowledge about where the virtue lands on this scale. Right? You try and find the mean and find the virtue. And then that will tell you how you should act, or how it's appropriate to act in that situation. And so now you've come to have a desire, or at least you know what desire you should have is, and you know how to act in accordance with it. And so if you are acting appropriately in ethical matters, you have practical wisdom. And so you're still emulating the first mover in a sense, since you're using your rationality. And so you're still living a good life, even though it's not the best one. Now, one important point to make here is that unlike Plato and Socrates before him, Aristotle didn't think that having this knowledge would lead you to do the right thing, right? It's not like once you come to a theoretical understanding that somehow you're going to act in that way. Aristotle said, look, you could have all of that knowledge, right? You could know what the mean is in every situation. You could know how to be courageous, temperate, modest, pious, just, so on and so forth. And you could know all the facts there is to know about those things. Yet still you might not be a virtuous person, right? You could still fail to be virtuous even if you have knowledge. So for Aristotle, in addition to having the knowledge about what is virtuous or where the mean is on each virtue, you also have to cultivate those virtues in yourself. And you can cultivate those virtues through habit and correcting actions. What do I mean there? Well, habit is pretty straightforward, right? If you just act as the virtuous person would all the time, eventually that'll just become a habit for you. And so you will just act virtuously in these situations. So sort of fake it till you make it, or practice makes perfect. Those are the ideas here, right? You know what to do, just make that your habit, and eventually you will become virtuous. But he also thinks, besides habit, we can become virtuous by taking use of corrective actions. So what does he mean here? Well, if you find yourself to be on the cowardly side of the scale and you want to be courageous, he says what you should do is overshoot, right? You should try and act a little recklessly sometimes, because chances are, if you try and shoot for the other extreme, you'll land somewhere in the middle, right? So if you're normally cowardly and you just try to be a little bit more courageous, you're probably not going to get there. You're probably going to fall very quickly back into your cowardly ways. But if you're cowardly and then all of a sudden you shoot for recklessness, you're probably going to land right in the middle. You're probably going to end up being a courageous person. Well, at least acting courageously in that scenario. And so if you're always cowardly, just shoot for reckless, shoot for reckless, shoot for reckless, make that your habit. Make those correcting actions your habit, and hopefully you'll move yourself more toward the mean of courage. Okay, so this second life is difficult, right? Not only do you have to gain practical wisdom, you have to know what's appropriate to do in all of these ethical matters by gaining knowledge of the virtues. But in addition to that, you have to cultivate a virtuous character. And so you need to find out the truth and then make your psychology situated so that you actually desire the true things about ethical matters. Okay, so the second best life is one in which we figure out what the virtuous person would desire and then habituate ourselves so that we act in this way. This is still a valuable life because it still allows us to emulate the first mover, since it's still an exercise of our function or purpose. But since it's aimed at the good for humans instead of the unqualified truth, it's not as good as the life of theoretical wisdom. So for Aristotle now, we understand what his ethics is all about. The ethics is about what is a good life, what is a good human. We now have an answer to both of those questions, right? A good life is one in which we are realizing our full potential or flourishing. We flourish by exercising our function excellently. That's by coming to understand or grasp the ultimate truths of the world. That's by coming to gain theoretical wisdom and trying to perfectly emulate the first mover. But we can also live this happier, flourishing life in a qualified way by having practical wisdom, coming to have knowledge of the virtues so that we know how to act appropriately in ethical matters. But really, at the end of the day, flourishing is about exercising what makes you unique as a human being, right? Flourishing is about what makes you most like the first mover. Now, even if you disagree with Aristotle on what flourishing consists in, right, I still think he has a powerful account of what makes for a good life. Right? It does seem that whenever you are flourishing is when you're living your best life. And so you can argue with Aristotle now about, well, when are you really flourishing? Is it really just by exercising your rationality? Is it by coming to have loving relationships, so on and so forth? But I think the underlying point remains true. The best human life is one in which you are flourishing. Okay, so hopefully we feel comfortable with Aristotle now. You're going to read a portion about his politics for the end of the week, and that's it for Aristotle. We'll move on to the Hellenistic philosophers next. Thank you, everyone.